the Ave Goddess podcast with spiritual detective Dr. Joanna Kujava and its motto, if you want to be spiritual, ask difficult questions. In this podcast, we discuss the archetypes of the Ave Goddess, the new forms of consciousness they inspire, as well as their interconnection between sexuality and spirituality. You can join the conversation by signing to the Ave Goddess podcast, my YouTube channel, Dr. Joanna Kujava, and even better, through my book, The Ave Goddess, Mary Magdalene and the Goddesses of Eros and Secret Knowledge, published by Sacred Stories. Today, we have a wonderful pleasure to have a conversation with Tobias Churton, who is the author of many books, and one in particular that we want to discuss here, Gnostic Mysteries of Sex. Hello, Tobias, how are you?
Hello, Joanna. Very well, thank you.
So first thing that I would like to ask you is, who is the man behind the work? Tell us something, what inspired your research on esoterica?
I suppose I can't resist a mystery.
Very good.
And I found that there was so much knowledge you could get through school. And then there was always this feeling that there was another realm of knowledge that schools and media did not communicate. And so I went to Oxford because I thought I would find higher knowledge. And I just found more of the same, really. And while there, I had to do a routine essay on the Gnostics. And it was meant to be a critical essay, obviously, because according to the course, the Gnostics, of course, were wrong and worse than wrong, and they were heresy. When I first read Irenaeus's attack on the Gnostics, written in about 180 AD, I thought that he'd misunderstood fundamentally what he was dealing with. He hadn't misunderstood the danger of Gnostic doctrines to Catholic doctrine. He saw that very clearly. What I thought he'd misunderstood was the experimental psychology evident, to my mind, in what some of the heretics were allegedly saying. And that sort of chimed in with other interests that I had as a young romantic poet, such as I was very interested in magic, and the romantic theory, the whole notion of a visionary plane of truth. So the Gnostics were always around. And when I left college, I determined I wanted to work in television because the church wouldn't take me as a priest at that time. And I wanted to do religious television. So I set about creating a television series about the history of the Gnostic Gospels and the subsequent appearances of Gnostic thinking throughout Western history afterwards. And that turned into a major project and took quite a few years to make. And out of that came a book. And then I thought I'd finished with the subject. That was that done. I could forget about it and get on with having some fun. And it just kept coming back. And more I learned, the richer the whole treasury of it became, and I'm now sort of stuck with it, having spent it seems, well, frankly, all my life pretty well going in and out of Gnostic labyrinths. So obviously there is I remember reading once, somebody said the study of Kabbalah was a lifetime study and worth a lifetime. And I remember reading that when I was 18 and thinking, what subject would anybody want to spend a lifetime on? I couldn't believe it. My idea was you crashed into a subject, commando raid style. You took what you wanted and you moved on. But I found that with the whole field of what is now called Western esotericism, a fancy name for the Gnostic stream, I'd say, but that's arguable, like everything else. I'd say that it has been extremely worthwhile and enriching and important too. Yeah.
And very important. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. So it actually started with writing of an essay at Oxford, right?
that was the specific interest in. I'd heard of Gnostics a bit, and I was always I think from quite a, even when I was at school doing A level, I think I was aware that there was this mystical side of Christianity, which had was ring fenced. It was regarded as an aberration of Christian tradition, but somehow you had to mention it. And I think most of the clergymen I've met and theologians since absorbed that view, and some of them it stuck, and consequently they're always hostile. I know the man who tried to get me into, didn't try to get me, he interviewed me when I first went up to Oxford. He was an evangelical Catholic, and when he realized that I was quite seriously into the Gnostics, I think he tried to get me out of the college. He felt he thought he was going to get a Catholic Orthodox priest out of me, and he realized he'd let in a free spirit, and to him that meant trouble. So I've had to pay all kinds of prices for this interest. It's not been a neutral academic one.
I must say that you've done much better than I did, because when I studied at the Pontifical Institute, I just bought into this. I thought, yes, they were really strange, because we were taught, the Manichaeans and so on, they had such strange theories. It was laughable, So at the beginning, I bought into this, and I later only, on my own, I discovered, that they were vilified, because they were considered dangerous, of course, right?
Yes. Well, they are dangerous to a certain way of thinking, aren't they, really?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's a subversive tradition, which claims to be authentic. And this really depends on, in the end, you have to decide for yourself whether they are a dangerous aberration or a rejected benefit.
That's right. That's right. So this actually leads me to another question. Why do you think institutional religions look down on sexuality and deny its use in for spiritual means?
I think the early Christian church was friendlier to women than the world outside. I think Christians were famous for burying widows, for example, caring for widows, and looking after the moral welfare of women in general, and were against prostitution, which was incredibly widespread, what we'd now call white slavery.
Yes.
So no, I don't accept it. I don't accept this this idea that no, it wasn't that. It was the view that flesh cannot inherit the kingdom, and this is Paul's Pharisaic education and his biblical reading. Flesh cannot inherit the kingdom. Therefore, sex encourages not only interest in flesh, but the continuity of it. And he recognized, as part of his tradition, that sex was very often the means to divert people from a spiritual goal. One was tempted out of it. And this idea of sex as temptation primarily is absolutely right in the Pentateuch and book of Genesis. Eve is tempted. Adam gives in to temptation. And it thrusts man down into the world of generation and reproduction, which even in the Gnostic view is, broadly in the Gnostic view, is very much a world in which the spiritual influence is diminished, sometimes altogether. So I don't think it was because of being anti-women.
Okay, I just mean he's saying about, women not speaking in the church, although of course
that was totally normal in synagogues. The woman's voice had to be controlled by a paternal influence, and that was a lot of the Jewish tradition. I don't suppose it was universal in all synagogues, and I'm sure there were some very dominant Jewish women who very much had their say. But I think Paul is rather boring on the subject of women, you could say. I think that's about all you could say. He's conservative. He's conservative morally. He likes family. He likes happily married people, that sort of thing. Although you've got to remember, I'm sure you don't need to remember that he thought he was living in the end times. So his view was very much, for most of the career where we have any evidence for his view, was that the kingdom, Jesus was going to come back and wrap up the material creation and institute a redeemed humanity. And in the redeemed humanity, of course, childbirth would not be painful, and there would be no need for children. And he didn't know much more about it. As he say, he saw through a glass darkly, but he thought the necessity for sex as a means of survival would be gone, and with it the pain and the subjugation also of women. And I suspect he shared very much the idea that spiritual life is a kind of androgynous or sexless way of being.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's the traditional point of view, but I was delighted to find in your book that you were talking about Gnostic groups who had a different view of sexuality. Would you like to give us some examples of that?
Oh gosh, there's far too many examples of it. I think the orthodox position on women that I've just said, the conservative one, was probably the minority.
Oh, that's interesting.
Maybe even an extreme minority in late antiquity. I think we are talking in a period after Caesar Augustus of a period of in the Western Roman Empire of extraordinary levels of sexual excess, and arguably excess from our point of view. It was a very, very sexual time, and enormous presence of the pleasures of the flesh were very much celebrated in Roman life, ordinary Roman life, and very much in the subjugated peoples of North Africa and the Middle East. And the Gnostic tradition of combining sexuality with religious idealism would have been, for a lot of people, quite a natural step and hugely attractive. And and I'm talking broadly when I say Gnostics, because there were so many different groups that we can half identify. But there are certain things we can talk broadly in common on a short interview like this. But I think that they had a rationale for why sex had got us in the mess, which they take very much from the Jewish tradition. But they have a kind of Greco-Egyptian attitude to putting that right. In other words, sex is the downfall of human beings because it is a sign of manifestation in the material world. It is a deformation of a primal unity into duality. So the fact that there are men and women is a sign of something wrong in the universe. And their gnosis, especially of the more sexually oriented Gnostics, was that it was only through embracing this duality of the male-female that one could, as it were, correct the wound, the damage done by Sophia, the mother, in the beginning of creation, which it was her sexual urge to know the Father in heaven that had, they believed, created the universe, which is full of death, decay, destruction, and every kind of deformity. So they thought the sex, you could by a sacramental approach to sex, you could heal the wound if you did it in the right mentality. And the Valentinians, April de Konik, a scholar, has done some wonderful work on Valentinian seed gnosis. And I think in these groups, the word sperma is very close to the word pneuma, and they're really interchangeable. Pneuma, spirit, is the seed which comes from God. And this seed is passed on through wisdom. This is all a product of Jewish and Greco-Egyptian speculation, especially in Alexandria, after the translation of the Septuagint in the 2nd century BC. So it's really what's happening when Hebrew ideas get translated into Greek and then translated again into Greek philosophy. So the Hebrew Chokhmah, wisdom, becomes Sophia, and in the Greek context, Sophia, being a feminine noun, becomes a kind of archangel, although she's very much described like that anyway in a lot of the wisdom literature of that late period before the 1st century. Wisdom of Solomon, wisdom of Jesus, son of Sirach, also in the Proverbs. So wisdom is already a figure of speculation, and she also has this double nature of being both whore, because she offers herself freely to mankind, and at the same time eternally pure, for her essential nature is divine. So you have these images already around, and the Gnostic groups tend to interpret these with a particular emphasis, so that the aspiration to spirituality can be expressed as a redirecting of the sexual urge. And you can imagine the heresiologists are so keen to say this is the problem. This is such a tempting idea, but they argue that in fact it led to kind of orgiastic loss of self-control amongst various groups. And so that any positive conception within this sexual gnosis, it tends to be thrown out completely. It's all a terrible satanic conspiracy against the pure truth. The Virgin Church is being defiled by these pagan ideas, and that was the teaching that, especially with the development of encretism in the 4th century, this idea that the flesh is not only a problem but actually to be discarded, and the development of monasticism. And you think that the church rebuilds itself in the Middle Ages on a monastic principle. You can then answer your original question, why sex is seen as the enemy, is because this whole monastic thing had defined flesh as the problem of man altogether. So any kind of surrender to what we would call natural urges was regarded as the road to hell. And these so-called Gnostic groups, their message is completely suppressed. And our fascination for it today is because we're coming out of the 20th century and a return to a lot of what would have been called at one time pagan pleasures and ideas, and what we like to think of as freedoms, and against a monolithic superculture which has developed in different ways across the world, of suppression of the individual and our natural desires.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. And more than that, this kind of division between sexuality, body, mind, and spirit is just extremely hurtful, right? So for our psyche. So I actually pay attention very much to your book, especially two groups. I remember two groups that you mentioned. I think they are called Nasenian Peratics. And they both were talking about using, sexuality and sexual fluids for sacramental reasons. And one of them, actually, the Peratics, were talking about something that you called serpent energy, which is basically, you also coined it as Kundalini energy, which is, of course, very well known in esoteric Hinduism and in Tantric tradition. So that really fascinated me, because I studied, Tantric traditions for many years, and I'm just a little bit intrigued. Where do you think it is coming from in these Gnostics groups? Is it because they got it from somewhere else, for example, in the East? because, for example, Joseph Campbell says that Buddhists were present already in the early Roman Empire. Elaine Pagel says that Brahmins were in Alexandria and in Egypt, frequent visitors. Or do you think that the source of this use of sexual energy for spiritual means is actually perhaps connected somehow to some Egyptian tradition or some other tradition? Where do you think it's coming from?
Well, if you ask my personal opinion, I think it's coming from India via Persia into Syria, and from Syria to Alexandria. I think that's the transmission. There are all sorts of little clues about that, I think, as you pick them up as you get closer to the tradition. The funny thing is when you look at these Gnostic traditions of that period, late antiquity, a great deal of attention today is laid quite rightly on the so-called Nag Hammadi library, but the real meat of the peculiarity of the Gnostics is much better revealed in the writings against them. If you start to, but you have to sort of put a template over them and sort out what is prejudice of the writer and what they might be referring to. And this is where I found Kundalini Gnosis in writings attributed to Simon Magus, who was a Syrian magician and a kind of savior figure to his followers. At least he was considered that 100 years after his death. That fascinating. You see, you've always got this thing in the Gnostic tradition, this period of late antiquity, 2nd, 3rd century. They will take a figure from history, and if they see something peculiar about them, they become then a revelation figure. So they've looked at the Old Testament and they've seen the figure of Seth, for example, in Genesis, who is the righteous brother and son of Adam, who starts this tradition of knowledge. And so you have the Sethite or Sethian Gnostics who take Jesus as being a kind of incarnation of Seth. Another figure is Simon himself, who's described in the Acts very briefly as the origin of simony. He is really built up in the 2nd century as a kind of Gnostic savior figure. Judas again, and of course Mary Magdalene. Yes. They notice something about her. There is a tradition of her associated with a wanton lifestyle, but she's also seems to be very close, but seems to have been rubbed out of the story a bit. Now, the Gnostic writers, and I suspect there were very few of these writers, by the way. I think I sometimes think that all the so-called Gnostic Gospels came from literally a handful of writers, because there are certain, what I'd call there's a running gag in them, which suggests a kind of an approach to biblical material. And it reminds me of things like the Monty Python period in the 70s, which developed a whole kind of humor. I mean, okay, it had Dadaist elements, it had surrealist elements, it had this, it had that, but in fact, it generated a whole attitude to what was funny. And I think my feeling about the Gnostic Gospels is that there is really a few minds who've put all this together and generate these texts. And I think there is an underlying humor to them, i.e. there's a sense of a joke that they've seen through. These Gnostics feel they've seen through something that's very straight and boring to something very exciting and liberating underneath it. That's the feeling one has of in fact, of what you might call today a decadent movement in the late Roman Empire. Now, the importation of Kundalini Gnosis would fit with that perfectly, because the idea of a Kundalini style Gnosis, a sexual Gnosis, based on bodily practices which can be practiced with a girlfriend or wife, etc. These offer an immediate challenge to the Orthodox system, which was a kind of we must be like the angels who neither marry nor are given in marriage, as St. Luke's Gospel has it. And they say, well, while we're on earth, no, we can turn this evil of the world right around. And I think the knowledge of specific, what you refer to by tantric practices or Hindu esoteric theories about rejoining Brahman, etc., would fit in very nicely into that, and we can then start to imply that Jesus was up to this kind of thing with Mary Magdalene. It fits very nicely, and create a new mythology of a secret Jesus tradition, where everything can be reinterpreted and, as it were, turned on its head. And it's fascinating. The concern today is that some people encountering this material may not realize that there is this, what I consider a sort of great joke going on. And it's cheeky, yeah, in the English sense of a certain wink, nudge and a wink, and yes, we know what that's all about, don't we? You know, I mean, when Gnostic ideas re-emerge in the late 19th century in France, quite explicitly, you have the immediate interpretation, for example, in the early Ordo Templi Orientis speculations, that this is my body which I give to thee, literally was Jesus giving his body, namely his sperm, to his disciples, that becomes the image of the bread. The wisdom speculation of Alexandria had already said that the Logos, the divine wisdom, is bread. It feeds the world. It's the inner nourishment of the cosmos. So you take that idea, you take it again, take it to another level, and it ends up with spermatic practices, where you reconceive what is normally regarded by patrician Romans as a substance of negligible spiritual meaning, and you give it a sacramental significance. That's very much in tune with the sort of tantric attitude of reconceiving the marital relationship in terms of a means to ascend to God.
Oh, that's right. Thank you, because I had the same intuition. So just wondered, your opinion about it. And now my goodness, we have to wrap up. So just, it's already
hardly started.
I know. This is the 30 minutes, too short. So what piece of esoteric wisdom would you give our listeners in this mid-pandemic or post-pandemic times?
I'm hoping that in due course people will forget this particular world disaster, but I suppose we won't. I can't. What advice could a spiritual person possibly offer to this thing, other than usual? To try to see beyond it.
Exactly, try to see beyond it. Thank you so much. So we are coming to an end. Thank you, Tobias, for your wisdom. And we have to finish our podcast. And if you enjoyed this conversation, sign in to the Other Goddess podcast, my YouTube channel, and consider buying my book, The Other Goddess, Mary Magdalene and the Goddesses of Eros and Secret Knowledge, published by Sacred Stories. And of course, Tobias's book, Gnostic Mysteries of Sex. Until next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joanna.